So as a NLP engineer, it feels so good to finally have the attention back on the language models where everybody's excited about working on, BERT and GPT taking mainstream, and almost everyone talking about what GPT is. Like, it gives you goosebumps, and it's in a very good way.
So are we kind of expecting too much from every company to suddenly become an AI company overnight?
Yeah, I think that's very good point brought up, because certainly because of this wave, everybody is wanting to do AI, and some people are not even like, if your team does not have AI researchers, not even researchers, like AI builders, for example, what are you even talking? Like, you need to have some foundation on which you want to now start experimenting and whatnot, right?
With the current state of Gen AI and in particular LLMs, like who do you think or what are like use cases are these like well positioned to be most useful for at this time?
Any application that has a human in the loop will be super ready to get started, and I don't even think they need to think twice about what are the right ways about this whole bias and fairness and all of that, as long as there is a human involved. I know the human also comes with their own bias and everything, but then it is like super powerful to have a human in the loop versus just automating a bunch of stuff and hoping it all works out.
Hey everyone, welcome. Sean Faulkner here, one of the hosts of Software Huddle, and today on the show, Vino Duraisamy from Snowflake. Vino has been working as a data and AI engineer for her entire career across companies like Apple, Treeverse, and now Snowflake. And in this episode, we dive into her thoughts on what's happening in AI right now and what a practical LLM strategy for a company should look like. We discuss the hard, unsolved problems in the space like privacy, hallucinations, transparency, testing, and bias. There's a lot of problems. And we're very much in the Wild West days of AI, and it still takes a ton of work to move beyond prototype to production with any AI application. There's lots of hype, but not necessarily that many enterprises actually launching products that take advantage of these generative AI systems yet. I thought Vino had a lot of real-world perspective to share, and I think you're going to enjoy the conversation. And if you do, please remember to subscribe to the show and leave a positive rating and review. All right, let's kick it over to the interview with Vino.
Vino, welcome to Software Huddle.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today. Excited to talk to you.
Yeah, I'm always excited to talk to you. I think we met a couple of years ago now, but let's start by having you introduce yourself. I know you've been in the data engineering and AI space for most of your career. How did that start, and what led you to the position that you're in today at Snowflake?
Oh, okay. I guess when I started out, I was working as a data engineer, and I thought, looking and taking inspiration from the software engineering world, at that time, full stack software developers were quite the thing. And I was like, oh my God, data is lagging behind software engineering by a decade. Probably 5-6 years from now, full stack data engineering is going to become the next big thing. So I'm going to have to build that experience end to end. So I consciously took opportunities as data engineer and then ML engineer, worked with big, companies like Nike and iProtech, and, Apple, built that end to end ML experience. And then only for me to realize that the data world has decided to go on a completely different end. Now we have, so many different roles with almost overlapping responsibilities, and it's kind of impossible to combine them all together into just one full stack role. But it's been a very interesting journey, even as a data engineer with that ML experience, or as an ML engineer with the data experience, it helps you understand the different components in your entire pipeline, and kind of worked out well for me in the end anyway. Currently, I work at Snowflake as a developer advocate, focusing on data engineering and the language model workloads. So it helps to have that wider breadth of knowledge about the two different fields, having worked, in those two experiences.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like a natural maturity curve for any discipline is, as an area gets, essentially matures, you get more specialization. Like if you were, a doctor, like a medical doctor from 100 years ago, you did everything. You took splinters out of people's toes and you performed surgery and delivered babies. But now, like the level of specialization that happens in the medical field is like really, really like specialized, and we're seeing that more and more in engineering, software engineering, and data engineering, and so forth. Like there's just too much to know at this point for any one person to kind of like cover it all. And you have to essentially reach some level of specialization as, areas scale and like and companies grow, and in the particular in the data space, there's just so much data to deal with. You end up having these like specialized roles to kind of just like manage it.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I guess more than like the industry maturing, looking at the number of tools we have in the data and AI space, it's kind of almost impossible for just any one person to pick up tools end to end to be able to do that. So I guess that kind of contributed to the story as well. But I see the roles getting very specialized and niche, and it's all good, I guess. We have AI engineering roles and prompt engineer roles coming up and whatnot.
Yeah.
So it's going to be fun to watch out.
Yeah, new things all the time. So you're a developer advocate at Snowflake, and you mentioned you know essentially having some general knowledge helps because you can probably flex across different areas, talk to different types of people. But are there particular areas of focus at Snowflake that you have, or particular product lines that you are more focused on?
Okay, so I'm not focused on a specific product line per se, but then broadly the data engineering workloads and a little bit of LLM workloads as they come on. But yeah, that's pretty much all I do. I almost do in workloads and whatever. There is also like another workload focused on app developers, where Snowflake native apps are the next big thing. But I'm not so much involved in the app development side of things.
Yeah, that's actually the area that I'm probably most involved in. So you also, you mentioned, where you started your career, you kind of bounced around from some big tech companies like Apple and Snowflake, but you've also worked for startups like Lake FS.
Mm-hmm.
How would you compare and contrast those experiences?
Ah, wow. Okay. I guess when I worked with the bigger companies like Nike and Apple, for example, there was a lot of process and everything in place. So it's easy for you to kind of hop on board. And on week two, you're already ready to understand what's going on. And you have something easy to kind of start contributing to because the process and the method, everything is in place for you. But then, like, startup was like a true wild journey for me because I never worked with a startup before, and then to work for a Series A startup trying to identify our product market fit and everything, it's almost like you become a Swiss Army knife of sorts. You end up doing everything. Like sometimes you're doing community, sometimes you're doing product and a bit of engineering, updating the docs and whatnot. I think it helped me broaden or like widen the horizons of what's going on in the different different niche areas within the field and all of that. But I guess the main difference, like at least I see with Snowflake and with Lake FS, for example, is Lake FS was all about almost survival, trying to identify, do we even have a product market fit in this specific niche of a product? But with Snowflake, it's like, oh, it's an already established behemoth, and all we're trying to do is kind of think about scaling every single thing. So you think of even the smallest of initiatives and programs, like the first thing on your mind is, oh my God, how am I going to scale it? Because Snowflake scale is entirely different game compared to Lake FS. So I guess working with problems at scale is probably the biggest difference for me, and getting used to, do that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's also a lot of course, variance in the world of startups. It's very different working for, say, Series A versus Series D, where, presumably a Series D is hopefully found product market fit, and they're actually working on some of those scale problems versus being very early. It's a lot of, unknowns that you have to try to navigate. And it's both exciting, but also can be a little bit, like jarring because you're constantly context switching and maybe, owning different types of roles and kind of stepping in and trying to solve a variety of different problems.
Mm-hmm. Yep, for sure. And it's fun also, with Snowflake, for example, right? Like with the scale also comes that there's so many people that you can like fall back upon. There's like tons of resources that you can leverage and make it work for your programs and whatnot.
Yeah, you're not the first person to ever like have this particular problem in the history of the company. There's probably been someone who's like laid some of the groundwork or thought through it for you. Like you could be a startup and be, I don't know, like like it needs some healthcare coverage thing, and no one knows the answer to the question or something like that because no one's ever experienced it before.
Yeah, for sure. It was super helpful and it helps you.
Yeah, so I want to talk about real LLM strategy with you. So there's a ton of course, going on in generative AI right now, and it's kind of hard to grok sometimes what's real and truly impactful when it's buried sort of under 50 feet of like overhyped AI marketing fluff. So first of all, as someone that actually has real NLP and AI experience, what are your thoughts on the hype? Is this just a hype cycle or is this something new? Like kind of, what's it all mean from your standpoint?
No, I mean, this clearly is a hype cycle for sure. And I feel it is in a good way because 2 years ago, when I was working with language models, NLP was not the coolest areas to work on. At that time, the world was, all the rage was all about computer vision models and object recognition and object detection. Like that was the coolest thing everybody wanted to work on. So as a NLP engineer, it feels so good to finally have the attention back on the language models where everybody's excited about working on, like, BERT and GPT taking mainstream and almost everyone talking about what GPT is. Like it gives you goosebumps and it's in a very good way. But I feel, I guess, part of having all the attention and limelight come to you is also not everything is being fully understood, because suddenly ChatGPT was everywhere and everybody was using ChatGPT and nobody fully truly understood what exactly it was for and what are you supposed to do with it, what does it mean to you, and there is a lot more to it. I mean, if within the researcher community we are debating as to, oh, can ChatGPT do reasoning and all sorts of math related tasks, then what would you think about a common man trying to understand what ChatGPT can do and cannot, right? It literally like just hit the world and we were like, okay, what is this? What are we supposed to deal with it? And it was like almost a shock. In a way, I feel like that probably is an aspect that needs a lot of eyes and involves, I mean, it should involve some sort of an understanding and regulation of what's going on over there.
I see. So you think that there was essentially the excitement and hype around something like ChatGPT, but not necessarily like true understanding from, maybe the general public or even people who are like, in the engineering space.
Yeah, for sure, right? I guess, like, you summarized before, like, it's great to have the hype because that's how now you're going to make, how difficult it was to probably take these, data people and the company's executives to focus on and invest in data and AI a couple of years ago. And now, thanks to the hype, you don't need to sell these AI tools. Like, it's not that hard to get any investment or any buy-in to build these AI projects within these companies. The best thing that could have happened to AI teams. But then it also means that probably it's on the AI researchers and developers to kind of build that sort of understanding and expectation within the, executives as well.
I think a downside of this as well could be that essentially because there's such an appetite for investing in AI, either within an organization or even within the venture capital market for startups, there's also room for a lot of like, I don't know, snake oil salesmen, selling a dream that maybe is not quite close to a reality. Would you say we're sort of in the wild west of the days of AI to some degree?
I think for sure. I mean, Wild West in the sense, I feel like everybody's like, oh my God, AI is going to be the next big thing. But how exactly is it going to impact your specific business or your line of business or your domain, your industry? I don't think any of us have, gotten that narrowed down. We've all been using AI and ML and the classical, machine learning models for different use cases and whatnot. But then looking at a powerful model like this, we have still not figured out what to do with it. And I remember I was there at a bunch of, hackathons in SF last week and like in the last few months as well. There were like two separate tracks, one for all kinds of chatbots, one for, is there anything other than chatbots anybody else out there is doing with these LLMs? Because every other production workload or use case that I hear of is some version of some co-pilot or some assistant or something that's reading the documentation and answering questions for people. That's essentially, I would say, like maybe a customer assistant, right? But that's literally all that we're thinking of at this point. But we're still yet to explore what other use cases can it be applied for and whatnot. And of course, multimodal stuff's coming in with all these great beautiful images that you can create with Yesterday, OpenAI also announced the text to speech model and then Whisper, and it's like the whole multimodal stuff has not been explored as well. Primarily, the focus has been on LLM, and we've not been able to get past this whole chatbot type application.
Yeah, I think that to some degree, people's first introduction in a lot of ways, or a lot of people's first introduction to what you can do with Gen AI is ChatGPT, which naturally makes you think about, or it could be GitHub Copilot, but it naturally makes you think about chat and these types of use cases. It's kind of like the lowest hanging fruit, like entry into using some of these systems. But I think the real like impactful work that I'm excited about is some of the things that are going on in like the world of biotech around using generative AI for drug discovery and sort of really transforming an entire industry from something that historically has been more less of an engineering discipline and a little bit sort of like accidental discovery and very expensive, and it could really lower essentially the cost and also increase the time to market, or decrease the time to market. And then also, things around like real-time translation is something that now people are talking about actually being a reality within the next few years, where, I could be speaking to you and you could have a headphone in and like it's real time and you're just, hearing it in whatever language that you need to hear it, which would be like incredible thing to see as well. So I think we're not that far away from going beyond the chatbot but I think that it's kind of like the natural entry point for a lot of people to think about.
Yeah, I think for sure. And yeah, I guess personally excited about using it on the creative aspects of it. For example, like writing, like it's literally going to help like, every person on earth to write better. And not everybody has that, like quirky, funny, humorous way of writing a blog, say, for example. And it's like super helpful when it comes to those aspects of it. And in general, like any sort of creative way of using it, I guess one of the most interesting ways I've had people tell me how they use it is I met a couple, and I guess they are from two different countries, so they come from two different backgrounds and cultures, so they have their own version of heroes or superheroes, call them, in their own culture and religion. And to teach their kids about them, they are using ChatGPT to kind of collaborate these two worlds together to write stories. And I was like, wow, that's so, like almost sounds magical to me. And I'm like, that's beautiful. And that's probably is the power of ChatGPT to be as creative as it can be. And I mean, I don't know. You tell me, how difficult is it to come up with new stories every day to tell your kids to put them to bed? Maybe come up with fancy new world that would involve Superman and Yoda and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I use ChatGPT to pick my son's weekly show and tell items. So I don't think I'd definitely be relying, when he gets to the point where he wants to hear a custom story from me, I'll be relying on AI to help me generate that. But one of the other things that we mentioned was this. There's such an appetite for businesses to try to, either invest in these technologies, give more resources to their, AI and data teams, which is great. But is it realistic to some degree? Like essentially, based on my experience, I think most companies struggle to even do analytics well. So are we kind of expecting too much from every company to suddenly become an AI company overnight?
Yeah, I think that's very good point brought up, because certainly because of this wave, everybody is wanting to do AI, and some people are not even like, if your team does not have AI researchers, not even researchers, like AI builders, for example, what are you even talking? Like, you need to have some foundation on which you want to now start experimenting and whatnot, right? But I feel like that may not be that big a deal, because now we have a slew of tools that come in. I mean, again, like I guess a line of self promo here, but then I saw the snow day announcements and Cortex trying to enable analysts with this all the ChatGPT powered functions, and I'm like, oh wow, so you can be a data person who have nothing to do with any AI stuff, but why do you have to worry about it, right? Like, let's say if I'm using SQL all these years and I use the average and the min and the max functions, just like I know how a calculator would do them. I don't have to worry about how it is being run internally. So why can't I do the same thing to create like product descriptions or to create something? like taking the power of these ChatGPT from AI stuff to all the different use cases by building these different products has been a very interesting thing too. So I feel, there is going to be bimodal distribution of companies when it comes to adoption, right? So one who actually have these ML engineers and builders who want to build solutions for themselves, probably going to be very highly custom based on their domain data set and whatnot. And there's going to be another group of companies who are probably going to be using solutions from all the different companies to kind of take in their AI needs and requirements.
Yeah, and I think that we'll get better at building abstraction layers that make it easier to essentially even customize some of the kind of out of the box functionality. Like you mentioned Cortex, like there's functions for, summarization, for a question and answering, for translation and so forth. But then I think when you start getting into trying to customize it for a specific domain, then you need to, like today, it's still like a fair amount of effort to build like a whole like embedding model and kind of use information retrieval methods to pull the right context to feed into the LLM, and then make sure that you're not giving too many tokens. And there's quite a bit of work that's involved in that process today. But I think that's going to get easier with time. It's kind of like the nature of any like early technology. And it's going to get simpler for people to do that kind of work without deep expertise in machine learning.
Yeah, for sure. Because I feel like, think about Postgres having a PG vector DB, right? So now everyone's gonna, like, every existing data tool or AI ML tool is gonna kind of arm themselves to be able to serve their customers better in terms of these AI aspects of it. And yesterday, I was like, last week, I literally spent all my time to build a retrieval augmented generation based LLM assistant, trying to understand how should I chunk and going to Llama index and trying to identify what should, all sorts of in the weeds trying to build an LLM chatbot. And then yesterday, OpenAI people tell me, oh, you know what? You don't need to do anything. Why don't you write a small prompt and then we would create a custom GPT for you? There is built-in retrieval, there's built-in, vector. Like, you don't need to worry about embedding, creation of embeddings, storage of embeddings. Don't need to deal with vector databases. And I'm like, oh, wow. So this is only going to get better and better. So I feel the long tail of companies who don't have those AI resources are going to probably benefit the most, because you don't need to do anything, but you still get everything, handed it over to you on a platter because you can access all these tools to do the same.
Yeah. So even though there's this like transformation that's happening, and I think the closest like analogy that I've experienced is like the introduction of the internet in terms of like a hard sort of line drawn in the sand of like we had like the pre-disconnected Dewey Decimal System era of the world to like the connected world where I can talk to pretty much anybody that's connected to the internet in the world. And we've come a long way in the last 30 years since I was sort of introduced. But now we're sort of, I think, drawing another hard line in the sand of like the pre sort of AI era to the post AI era. But do you think there's a danger when it comes to all the hype that's going on, where a lot of the investment dollars are going to go into essentially companies that are doing something in that space, or even on the research side, probably researchers that are getting the most funding right now, or getting their talks or conference talks or journal submissions accepted and stuff like that, are going to be kind of riding the hype train to some degree?
Yeah, I mean, very much. This has been like a, I don't know, personal pet peeve of mine for a while now. Well, we had classical ML models, right? Let's say you built a model for housing price prediction, and you know for a fact that it cannot be 100% accurate model, and it made mistakes on some data points, and that was totally fine. And that's kind of how the world operated, right? And this is ChatGPT. It's just a different type of model. It's a text generation model and whatnot. Even this model is supposed to have some errors. Like, that's the whole point of it. Like, we know that it cannot be 100% accurate. But then for some reason, when ChatGPT is giving you wrong messages or responses, like, we have somehow compared it and humanized it, saying, oh my God, the models are hallucinating. Oh my God, is ChatGPT lying? Is it intentionally lying? What is the intention? I'm like, oh, what? Just because now you want to create a term, like coin a whole new thing and then go do some research. Again, like, basically ask ChatGPT a couple of times and then be like, oh my God, so ChatGPT is lying, and we built a framework to understand how it lies. And I understand that we're trying to ride the wave and the hype cycle and all of that, but I do feel like to some extent we're like stretching it too further because at the end of the day, it is an ML model, just a large language model, but it is also still bound to, produce the errors. It cannot always be wrong. I mean, it cannot always be right, but it's like humanizing it and trying to like I feel it's probably just to get more papers out, but again, it's not I wouldn't call it this is the right direction for us to go, but I feel this is probably a cycle too, maybe.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like, more clickbaity. It's going to get you more views to refer to these things as like lying and hallucinations than essentially like, error rates, precision and recall from like traditional machine learning, right? When a traditional sort of classification model misclassifies, I don't know, my Fitbit exercise as a sit up when I was doing a push up, like that is what we would report as an error rate. And we don't really have a big, no one makes a big deal about that. But when essentially like a GPT model or another type of LLM produces something that's like misinformation, then I think it's because it feels more human, the output of it, then there's a stronger reaction to it for some degree.
Yeah, I think I understand, like you said, right? Just because the responses are more human like, we're maybe a little bit more scared and take it very seriously when something is wrong, like when the responses are wrong. But then again, if as researchers or the academia and the industry together are trying to hype it up unnecessarily, then what would you like? How does it, what are the ripple effects of that within the common folks? And people are going to be like, oh my God, these AI models can lie. And these AI models, I cannot trust these AI models. And it is important for us as the community to maybe build some rules around models so it becomes more and more trustworthy, and as a society as a whole we get more used to having these models and to help us really. But then if we ourselves are inventing these new constructs and kind of producing or like creating these scary scenarios, like what would you expect the media to pick up and what would you expect common folks to understand from this, right? I feel like there is this whole responsible AI and there's a whole field of it, but it's just not for people who are researching in the responsible AI and ethical AI field. It should be for literally every person who's working with AI to some extent to have that ownership and accountability and be responsible when you talk to or even come up with these new terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, I think also, in the sort of abstract academic sense of an AI innovation, in many ways, like the goal might be to mimic humans or even outperform humans in some respect. But to be human also means to be flawed and sometimes have, bias or lie. But the bar for AI is much higher. We want like human level or better performance, but we also want to eliminate all bias and all error. So I guess like what are your thoughts on sort of the balance between creating something that sort of like mimics or feels human, but also making sure that it isn't essentially performing errors, or we understand that there's potential errors, or even on the flip side when you mentioned responsible AI, you can get into the potential for toxicity or bias.
Yeah, I think so when you think about this whole humans are not fair and we have inherent biases and everything. And then how is this AI model being trained? It is being trained on the data on the internet. And it's all the data that we created as humans are going to be biased inherently. So when you trained your model on the data on the web, what did you expect it to be? Like, isn't it obvious that it is going to be biased? It's not going to be fair? And everything that a normal human would have is going to be there with the ChatGPT or any other AI model too. And I feel like we're trying to almost even demonize it, saying, "Oh my God, ChatGPT responded something so sexist," and I'm like, "Hey, it's." I mean, I guess the better analogy for that would be a child just growing up in the world, right? And the world is an unfair place, but then when you bring up your child, you are trying to kind of set boundaries and make some sort of a protective mechanism, like you as a parent make sure the child has this protective environment to grow up So it doesn't mean just because the world is fair, you let the child out in the world and be like, you know what, you deal with it. You're gonna have to because the world's unfair. We do create whatever protective environment we could to make sure, as much as we can, again, to make sure the child grows up, in an ideal way with ideal behaviors, ideal modeled behaviors. I guess very similarly, even with this model, right? Like looking at the size of these language models, it's probably impossible to create synthetic data that is out, purely fair and out of bias and everything to train these models. And then I don't even think they will respond human-like with all of that. It's kind of impossible to create this ideal data set to train these models, right? You've got to work with what we've got, which is this biased data set. But then though, like take this biased data set, train the model's doing good, but then you need that protective environment or some sort of a post-processing layer for your specific applications to make sure, the bias and the fairness and the toxicity and all of that are being kept under control. That's almost a straightforward approach, but I feel it's garbage in, garbage out. So the problem is in the data. Where does the data come from? So the problem is in the world. Like, why are we demonizing AI models for that? Like, that's pretty much all it can do. So I feel that is also something. I don't know how the narrative was built out, but then this entire demonizing AI and like the world's gonna end, and this whole, like, I also read up about this Future of Life Institute. So they've created this entire, almost like a research field now to make sure how are we going to make sure we don't go extinct, or like AIs are not going to become a threat to us, and like a whole different thing. And I'm like, I don't know what's going on behind the screens of like what is even the thought process behind such a thing. But I feel like we should not demonize AI just for the sake of our own short-term benefits of whatever it may be, like publishing a paper and getting grants and funds and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, there's enough kind of fear around technology innovation, in particular things that are like AI, robotics. I think quantum computing's another one that we've kind of touched on. Those are like the three like hot button subjects that like make people scared. And I think part of it is just like they're complicated. Not a lot of people understand everything that's involved. It feels a little black boxy, and there's potential for major, impact on, people's, maybe their jobs or whatever it is. And we probably, as people working in technology or researchers working in this field, we're sort of doing ourselves a disservice by, I don't know, like coming up with terms that sort of fuel that fear even more.
Right, exactly. I mean, the responsibility is literally on us to make sure we help the world understand what these tools and models are so we can all benefit from it together, but not the other way around. But hey, I guess probably this is how it starts, and it takes some time to kind of go over the fence so the world can also be okay with the AI modes.
So one of the things we touched on when you were talking there in terms of, like garbage in, garbage out. And as much as we're in this like AI revolution, it's very much like a data revolution. We couldn't have the models that we have today 15 years ago because we didn't have enough like digitized data to even do the training. Can you talk a little bit about the value of data when it comes to AI training?
Okay, yeah, for sure. I guess I'm not sure where I heard this from, but it's like all your AI problems, or at least most of your AI problems or ML problems, are going to be data problems, right? If you have this right ideal data, like training data to train your model, of course, is going to turn out well. But then when it comes to the data, there is like a bunch of things, of course, like the standard data quality issues and making sure you have the right kind of data and you're using the right kind of features. And there was this classical ML problems with feature engineering and everything, which kind of got away thanks to these LLMs. Now we don't even have control over what features do we want to use and everything, so it's all taken care of by itself. But then coming up with this data and identifying, and to some extent, although we don't have control over what data exists out there in the world, but then taking that data and doing some sort of pre-processing and massaging and making sure it's not too out, on the extreme before you train the model is super important. But I feel at this point in the cycle, not a lot of the companies today are using their own data to fine tune the models, or using their own data to build a model or train a model from scratch. That's probably why we've not, talked about the data quality issues, or how does one even prepare the data to train a model like GPT, for example. So we've not even as a community, I feel like we've not even gone there and touched upon all of that a lot. But I feel more and more, as the field matures and a lot of tools get introduced to make it easy for us, there is going to be, again, like the foundational and the fundamental problems of data quality is going to become, I guess it's probably a cycle. It's probably going to become the next big thing in the next couple of years.
Well, even I've heard that a lot of the innovation that's happened in particular in like the GPT models from moving from like 3 to 3.5 to 4, a lot of it's not necessarily like major changes in sort of how they're doing deep learning. They're actually changes around how they're like preparing the data and ensuring like higher data quality and reducing, the propensity for like hallucinations and so forth. So it's really about like how do we innovate at the data level rather than necessarily like big changes to what's happening at the deep learning level.
For sure, yeah, right? Because there are like two big components to it. One is like the pre-processing layer, and the other one is the post-processing. Pre-processing is literally all data problems, and I'm not sure what happened to the initiative. If you remember Andrew Ng, he came up with this term called data-centric AI and data-centric ML, I think probably a couple of years ago before ChatGPT was the entire thing. And his ideology was that, you know what, we may not be able to do a lot of improvement to the models by just playing around with the hyperparameters as much, because there is only so much you can do by playing around with hyperparameters. But then if you fix the hyperparameters and work on your data, we will be able to further reach the higher metrics in terms of accuracy or F1 or recall or whatever. And that was one of the, I guess, successful ways in which industries and companies were also doing that, even when I was working as a language engineer. So it's gonna come back again, but probably a little later when we're ready for that, I guess, adoption.
In traditional machine learning, how do people usually go about measuring and improving data quality?
Okay, so I guess in traditional machine learning models, right, we measure the models using certain metrics, and then data quality is also measured in terms of, okay, if I do this pre-processing method, or if I do a standardization and a normalization, or even lemmatization and all sorts of these pre-processing features, it was almost like an experiment, right? It was not a test to data quality, but it was more of a test to, if I do this specific pre-processing, how does it affect the efficiency of my model? And that's kind of how we worked with. And one, using a specific feature over the other one was not necessarily a right or a wrong thing, but for this use case, for this model, this is the feature that gives me that, so it's all good. But when it comes to the not so traditional large language models, you cannot really do any of these handcrafted feature engineering methods to improve your accuracy, or there's not even accuracy. But then so, and the traditional methods again, right? Like if you do lemmatization and standardization and normalization, that you're not trying to create a, I guess, discrete output here. It's not just a simple prediction. So when you do remove all the extra context from the text that you're feeding in for your training, it's going to affect all the, the way in which it creates your output responses as well, which is probably why it has become a challenge for us to understand, okay, so for my large language model, I don't have an accuracy as a metric or F1 score as a metric, but then how am I going to make sure, what am I supposed to do with this data to get this ideal, positive, non-toxic kind of responses? I don't think we still have that, solved today to understand what kind of data quality metrics do I even need to use that data to train my large language models. It's almost still experimental, and we're all figuring it out, I guess.
Yeah. So just to kind of make sort of parse what you were saying there, and in sort of traditional machine learning, usually we have some idea of what we want to produce from the model as output. Like it's maybe it's a classification model or a predictive model or something like that. So we can essentially have some test set where we know what the prediction should be, and then essentially run the model against that test set to figure out how precise it was. And then we can make tweaks to the data to try to improve the quality and then run the test again and see if that improves it. But in the large world of large language models, it's not so clear because we're essentially generating text and it's not clear, like you're not going to necessarily generate the same text every single time because there's some randomness factor that's involved with the generation of text. And then it's also not necessarily clear like what is like a good response or not. If I tell it to write a blog post or something like that, the one version of that might be better than another based on my subjective understanding, but it's hard to necessarily empirically measure what is better.
Yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. Like you clearly summarized it, which is basically we don't have a great way of measuring how good an LLM model is. And when you don't have a metric to evaluate, so there is nothing you can, like, you're not knowingly, consciously, with the right intent tuning to get that, metric. So it's just almost throwing everything and then see what sticks kind of an approach is what we're doing with at least, training the LLM models currently. And we don't have but I guess evaluating an LLM model could be a whole different discussion in itself. And as a research problem, I don't think it's fully solved. We are still working on, coming up with different frameworks and benchmarks and whatnot. And currently, it's very interesting because we do have a bunch of frameworks that people use as benchmarks to see, okay, how good is my model performing on this specific, Q&A data set and whatnot. But again, you would have to create this data set for every different use case with every different industry. So it cannot be generalized. Like you cannot just say, what is the accuracy of the model and be done with it. Because everything is kind of non-deterministic here with large language models and text.
Yeah, and generally, I think the breadth of potential use cases much wider than what we should have seen from traditional ML. Because a lot of times where we've been successful historically with ML is on fairly narrow problems, whereas the LLM approach is more of a general solution to like a wide range of problems where you're going to apply AI. Like I could use it for question answering, for reasoning, for writing. I could do a whole bunch of different things, and then you can break it down by domain and stuff. What is good in one domain or one use case might be, drastically different somewhere else.
Yeah, for sure, right? Like the same model could be doing well for a specific use case and may not be for another one. So there is like no one standard metric to kind of uniformly say what's better, what's not.
So we touched on clearly like evaluation, testing, ensuring data quality, measuring data quality. Those are all big problems. What are some of the other like real problems in the LLM space that you think need to be solved?
Okay. I guess the biggest one being this whole governance, privacy, and security of it. It was funny because, again, going back to the OpenAI's Dev Day keynote yesterday, they had a very interesting announcement called Copyright Shield, where OpenAI will help their customers with the legal fees and everything on the legal front if there is a copyright infringement from using their APIs. And I'm like, wow, okay. And you do know that when you go to data conferences and you are watching the keynote, you have a bunch of data governance tools. How do you set up your RBAC and access control? Who gets access to what? And what are the PII governance mechanism? And what are we using to make sure our PII data is not exposed? And that is a whole different kind of a discussion, right? Like we have tools, we know what to do, and we're just trying to get the stakeholders to start doing that. Whereas come to these LLM ones, it was mind-boggling to actually hear someone say, "Oh, you know what? If you ever run into a problem, here is your insurance, for your legal support." And I'm like, "Oh wow!" So there was nothing on the security or the governance or the privacy, aspect to it, and I was, of course, shocked. But then it's also the Wild West. I guess the industry's like very much in the early stages, so it's kind of understandable.
Yeah, I think this is, I think this is one of the major problems with the space right now that needs to be solved. And I think for a lot of companies to really move beyond sort of like demos and proof of concepts to like production grade products that they can feel confident are, a risk of like a data leak or some sort of privacy infringement down the road. is they need to be able to figure out this problem. We kind of know, at least we understand the challenges with regular data management around, like you said, governance, RBAC, like all these types of things. Of we don't always do it and do it well, but we kind of understand. If someone comes to your business and says, "I want my data deleted," it might take a bunch of work to track down. It's not optimal to track down all those places that you need to delete it. You might not necessarily do a good job of it if you don't essentially have a lot of these tools and infrastructure in place to deal with these types of things like right to be forgotten. But we understand, delete the row from the database and it's gone. There's no delete a row from an LLM. So if sensitive data is part of that training process, or even part of an embedding model or something like that, there's no way to really delete that information. And I think that's a place that is one of the central challenges right now, that not necessarily sort of everybody's like really understanding the nuance there. And on top of that, it really comes down to not only not sharing the information, but how do we essentially train or augment models in a way that can still leverage essentially like copyright or private information without essentially leaking the information and then controlling access to it afterwards.
Yeah, I think the whole privacy and security aspect of it will not be fully solved until the field of explainable AI kind of comes into the mainstream, because today, right, we have literally zero control over how this, encoding and decoding happens within GPT models, and how it actually understands and makes sense of the input training data, right? We literally have just feed in the data and then it's just working on it by itself and it's done, which is probably why we don't have any control over how am I going to delete the specific data from a specific person, or how am I going to make sure this specific private set of data is not being exposed. Can't do any of that, only because we don't fully understand how these models work. But I feel these are like two parallel things, and maybe I'm not sure if you're on board with the same idea too, but I feel like unless the field of explainable AI moves further, it's going to be difficult for the security and the privacy components to kind of keep up with that.
What is, this is the first time I've heard that term, explainable AI. So I'm assuming that's essentially a way to for the AI to explain why it makes decisions. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Like if you think about the classical ML model, for example, right? So when you do have a certain prediction, there is always a way of going back and saying, okay, so I predicted the house prices to be this, but what were the factors, based on which you arrived at this price? Like, the number of room, like there are like input features you can always map back to. But when it comes to these, I guess fuzzy neural networks or anything after neural nets, really, there is no way of trying to explain how they do what they do, which kind of makes it like, even more fuzzier for us to understand, like, how are you actually going to identify how is your data, how is specific PII data getting encoded as part of the training process, and how are you going to make sure that specific part is not getting exposed and all of that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know. I know there's some recent research we actually touched on in a recent episode that around like trying to apply different methods for like deleting certain information from LLMs. It doesn't really solve, I think, the underlying problem. Most of them rely on fine tuning, which is expensive. Like they're not that realistic, a lot of the approaches that I've seen. Or there's just sort of the complete sealed off approach where it's just like, we're not going to let any of that information in, but then you lose out a lot of the value of the model of using potentially like your own, company documents, for example, to try to train an LLM or augment it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have a whole different story with this whole fine tuning of models, but I am not sure if that's probably the right way to do it. I guess I don't know if I can take the lessons from my previous language model training experience to large language models, but broadly, like one of the biggest challenges when it comes to fine tuning, for example, is when you have proprietary data, and if you train your model only on that proprietary data, like your company's documentation, for example, it's not even proprietary, but if it's just your company's documentation, and the model only knows about your company's product because it's only trained on the documentation. So when I'm going to ask questions, it's not going to talk something political or religious or anything scandalous. So you can be 100% sure it can hallucinate as to how do I use, what is the syntax of this function and whatnot, but it's not going to give you any scandalous related, topics. But when you take a generally available foundation model that was trained on this, world data, and then you try to fine tune it with your own documentation and whatnot, how are you still going to be sure that it's not going to respond to any random, irrelevant religious or political question, right? You can never guarantee that. And again, I guess even historically, transfer learning hasn't been as successful or like not so popular method when it comes to, fine tuning your existing model to a whole different task, because it also loses meaning. If the foundation model is good at ABC tasks and you're fine tuning it with a new task, you cannot be very sure that it is still able to do the ABC tasks it was originally,
Right.
trained for. So then, what is the point of it again, right? So you might as well have trained it on your own data. You can at least be sure that it's not going to talk any relevant things or like any scandalous things to your customers. So again, I'm not big on fine tuning, but I guess that's kind of how the world is going to evolve from prompt engineering to RAG to fine tuning, and then eventually we'll hopefully get to custom training of proprietary LLMs, but it's probably going to be a long way there.
Where with the current state of Gen AI and in particular LLMs, like who do you think it or what are like use cases are these like well positioned to be most useful for at this time?
I feel like all sorts of productivity tools are like super helpful, because when it comes to any of these, developer productivity or marketing productivity or like creative, any of these tools, there is still a human in the loop. It's just making our work easier or like making the getting started easier. So these kind of use cases I feel are like very well primed for taking, like, I don't have to worry about hallucination, I don't have to worry about all the 100 problems that come with GPT, because I know there is always going to be a human in the loop to kind of oversee what they're going to, like, what the tools are going to do. So at least for the moment, where as we're positioned today, any application that has a human in the loop will be like super ready to get started, and I don't even think they need to like think twice about what are the right ways about this whole bias and fairness and all of that, as long as there is a human involved. I know the human also comes with their own bias and everything, but then it is like super powerful to have a human in the loop versus just automating a bunch of stuff and hoping it all works out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to argue that things like GitHub Copilot and the other coding assistants haven't been valuable to people. I think people are seeing massive efficiency gains from that, but we're still a long way from just copying, pasting code, submitting it to production, and then hoping it works.
Yeah, it's but probably, yeah, it's a long way to go for sure.
And then, what are sort of your recommendations, I guess, for developers interested in the space or businesses? Do you think in your opinion, are people like asking the right questions when they're kind of like charging into the world of AI?
Okay. I think this is probably the greatest time to be a developer or anyone like a builder working in tech, really. Again, I'm sorry to keep going back to the OpenAI's Dev Day. I feel like at this point it's probably like a recap of the Dev Day keynote, but they had announced this, chat GPTs and the chat GPTs. GPTs and a GPT store where you can build your own custom GPT for any use case and then put it out in the store and people can use that, and almost like a one-on-one equivalent for me. Like, I was instantly able to connect to Snowflake Marketplace. So you put your data apps out there or like GPTs out there, and you can have your users use it and be done with it. And I'm like, probably even as a builder, right? You can be a one person founder and then go on to build $1 million or even like a build. You never know. So the opportunities as a developer with these kind of tools are like super cool and endless. And if you're not a builder too, again, right, with all sorts of, you create a custom GPT by writing an input prompt. Like, you don't even need to know, like, forget Python, forget this, forget that. I'm like, how cool is that? And if you do have a great use case and you may be able to make some money off of that, that's like putting so much power in the hands of the builders and developers, and that's like super cool. But when it comes to the organizations, though, it makes me really wonder as to what should the organizations really do? What should their approach be at this point? Because yesterday, after the announcement, I personally felt like a bunch of tools that I worked with might go obsolete because now, oh no, okay, done. But if you're an organization you who probably are already paying those companies to experiment and build with, what should you be even thinking? So, as an org, should I only stick to these big players, hoping that they will eventually catch up and there will be a feature parity? Or am I supposed to, take the bets and, try the new tool that's probably going to be a lot more useful to my team in the short run? Because, again, everything is like the competition is within the timeline, right? You want to be the first within your industry, within your a domain to kind of go win that and capture that market. So are you like supposed to experiment, be ready to, bet on the small startups? Or should you be like, I never know if the startup is even going to be there for a while. So do I wait for these big players to catch up? That's going to be, I don't think I have an answer for that, but that's kind of what I was thinking in my headspace was after, looking at all the announcements.
Yeah, I think that's always a challenge for all companies, investing in technology, even with the sort of the migration of to the cloud. I think, people face similar challenges. It's like, do I stick with like or do I invest in like the on-prem solution, or stick with my on-prem solution, or do I start to modernize and move to the cloud now? And it's always a delicate balance. And I think it really comes down to what, I guess, like having confidence in what either competitive advantage it gives your business, or the ROI that you're going to get to your business, and I guess your level of confidence that hopefully the company that you're investing in, like buying their licensing model, is actually going to be here in a couple of years. It's always a certain amount of leap of faith with that.
Gotcha. But yeah, I think that's going to be very interesting for me at least to watch out because, yeah.
Awesome. Well, as we start to wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share? Any other, sort of nuggets of wisdom that, or things that you've been thinking about?
I mean, I guess I probably have like one last pointer, which I feel is, again, coming off from my personal experience. I run into a bunch of folks at meetups and, hackathons and whatnot. And I see a lot of data folks who don't have a lot to do with AI are kind of isolating themselves and be like, oh, yeah, there's just a lot happening in the AI world. It has nothing to do with me. But then as a data engineer or a data analyst person, you know that it's going to come into your zone. Like you know it's like someone is building a AI model, you will be probably building the data pipeline to take the data to train. So it's always going to come into your zone for sure. So it's probably wise to keep up with. I know it's impossible to keep up with everything that's going on, but then it doesn't hurt to probably give some tools a try and just like keep abreast of what's going on around. So that's going to be very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar to any of these like digital transformation shifts that happen, like moving to the internet, moving to mobile, moving to cloud. Like you're kind of doing yourself a disservice by like writing it off as like nothing to do with me. I think this is something that's probably going to touch essentially every like facet of not only engineering but most people's jobs in some capacity over the next decade or so. So it's important, I think, to like at least educate yourself on what is happening and like how you might be able to leverage these tools to do your job better and more efficiently, or how you might even be able to contribute in an interesting way.
Yeah, for sure. This is going to be very interesting for everyone, especially for students. Like I'm doing a course like on my weekends doing this executive MBA thing. And I was kind of shocked that people were not even using ChatGPT for anything. And I'm like, oh, wow, okay. But you all work in tech. But then I'm like, no, but we don't work with AI. And I was like taken aback quite because I've met a lot of people who have nothing to do with tech and have been using ChatGPT too. Like I go to a parlor and the lady, she has a book club with her friends and then she uses ChatGPT to get the summary of the books. So she doesn't have to read the entire book, but then she can still go with her friends and sound smart and everything. So it's kind of very interesting to see the ones you think would be, catching up with all the tech developments are not. And then it's like ChatGPT, regardless of one's background, is kind of impacting
Yeah,
everyone.
quick ChatGPT is like the modern Cliff Notes version.
Right.
Gives everyone an opportunity to sound smart. Well, Vino, I want to thank you so much for being here. Hopefully, we'll see each other in person again, and I'm sure some sort of event coming up. But this was very enjoyable. We'll have to have you back down the road.
Yep. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I will hopefully run into a meetup or something in SF soon.
All right. Thanks. Cheers.